Welcome back to Arise News Hour. I'm Charles Golu. Now, Sudan's military leaders say they are scrapping all existing agreements with the main opposition coalition and will hold early elections. The statement came a day after a pro-democracy sit-in outside the army command base in Khartoum was violently ended by the ruling army. Around 35 people were killed. The military's move to hold a vote within 7 months cancels all agreements with protest leaders and who for months had been camped outside the military headquarters. The sit-ins have been the center of a campaign to bring democratic reform to Sudan, which has been ruled by a military committee since President Omar al-Bashir was overthrown in a coup in April.
The military council regrets the violence that has accompanied the operation of clearing the Nile Street this morning that went beyond the limits of the initial plan of the operation. The military council decided the following: to cancel all the agreements and to stop negotiations with the Declaration of Freedom and Change forces, calling for general elections within a period that does not exceed 9 months under regional and international observation, to form a caretaker government to implement the transitional mandate that represents the following: to set accountability and to uproot all the former regime symbols who were involved in corruption crimes, to form the foundation of lasting and sustainable peace in the conflict zones and the return of the displaced to their villages. We are promising to investigate today's incidents, and we are calling on the General Prosecutor to handle the issue. We are calling all the people to raise the value of the homeland and to spread the spirit of tolerance and forgiveness. Our doors remain open to hear the honest, national and constructive voice that will bring the country to a safe place.
Well, for more on this, let's cross over live to London now and speak to the African Affairs analyst and publisher of Africa Briefing, John Ofei-Ansah. Good to talk with you, John. I mean, it looks like the tension between the two sides has been growing over the past few weeks following calls by the opposition for a general strike and for a fully civilian-controlled transitional government. And clearly the military council on their side were not willing to let go of their control over power.
Yes, it appeared things were going well, relatively well, and but it appears it has taken a different turn altogether since the head of the junta, General al-Burhan, paid visits to Saudi Arabia, and another general also paid a visit to Egypt. It appears things have turned, and the junta has, like you said in your report, has reneged on the agreements reached with the protesters so far, and called for a general election in 9 months' time, saying that this was the only way, democracy, and normalcy could be restored in Sudan. But the protesters, led by the Sudanese People's Professional Association, are hell-bent, are digging in their heels and demanding that the power must be handed over to a completely civilian regime.
So let's talk about this controlled transition, John. Elections in 9 months. The protesters wanted longer, as we heard earlier, because they think the former regime is so entrenched you can't have free and fair elections and civil society can't operate. I mean, are they right? And if so, what will happen in 9 months if the elections go ahead? A farce?
Yes, you see, there is a complete, breakdown of trust, on the part of the protesters, of the civilians, because if you examine the situation carefully, it looks like a palace coup, they want to sort of maintain the status quo, but under a different guise, under a different look or a different name. Right? This is what the protesters are demanding. That if there was any transitional or any transitional arrangement, should be completely be composed of civilians and no without any involvement by any military. So this was the crux of the matter. I mean, they had negotiations until I think last week or the week late last month, when it was agreed that or the legislative body will be composed by civilians, right? But like I said earlier on, after the visit by General Al-Baham to Saudi and another one of the generals also to Egypt, everything changed. And the people are saying, I mean, it's not a question of negotiation; it's a demand, being made by the people, for power, to be handed over to civilians for a complete restoration of democracy in the country. I mean, the civilians, the protesters, completely, have no faith, have lost all confidence, in the military. Judging from what al-Bashir, how he handled the country, and judging by what these people are doing, it appears the current junta is reading for the same page as deposed al-Bashir.
Well, I have to say, John, we lost you for a few seconds in between your sort of analysis there. But let me ask you this. I mean, you've talked about the civilians. What about the military? Does it seem as if the military in Sudan is speaking with one voice? Because, I mean, the Sudanese army does not apparently have a monopoly of force in the country. I understand that there are also multiple paramilitary organizations, and within the army itself, we hear there are some that are sympathetic to the protesters, sort of like some of the junior and middle-level officers.
Yes, it appears like you said, there's a split within the army itself. Because don't forget that al-Bashir set up this paramilitary force, popularly known as the Janjaweed, whose sole purpose was to offer protection to al-Bashir, and they are still in force. But the large majority of the officer corps of the regular army are rather sympathetic to the civilian cause. So these recent run-ins, between the paramilitary and the civilians, which caused about 35 deaths, is not a direct result of a confrontation with the regular army, but a result of confrontation with the paramilitary, with the Janjaweed, who are hell-bent on crushing let's say the uprising by the civilians.
And you mentioned earlier, John, that the protesters are determined to go back to their protests. I mean, if they do that, what will be their fate? Is there a great risk that after the security forces carried out this sort of massacre we saw yesterday, the violence is likely to continue?
It is likely to continue. I mean, nobody can tell us that, because it appears that the Janjaweed, so far even today, they surrounded one hospital where most of the wounded, were being treated. Okay, they also try to prevent people from going to the mosque today to celebrate Eid. So, and try to shift the celebration of the Eid to tomorrow. Okay, so the situation is rather unpredictable. It could escalate, to any level at all. And like I said, the people too are prepared. They are prepared to dig their heels in and demand what they want: a complete restoration of a civilian democracy within the country.
Okay. John, I want to thank you very much indeed. John Ofe-Ansah is the African Affairs Analyst and publisher of Africa Briefing. Welcome back to Arise News Hour. I'm Charles Aniagolo. Now, the number of people killed in the crackdown on pro-democracy protests in the capital, the Sudanese capital Khartoum, has risen to nearly 100. It comes as protest leaders have rejected an army offer for talks. The head of Sudan's military council had offered to resume negotiations with the opposition alliance a day after he said that all agreements reached so far had been scrapped. Meanwhile, members of a feared paramilitary group are reported to be roaming the streets, attacking civilians. 40 bodies are reported to have been found, dumped in the River Nile. The violence began when forces of the Transitional Military Council opened fire on unarmed protesters demonstrating at a sit-in on Monday. The sit-ins have been the center of a campaign to bring democratic reform to Sudan, which has been ruled by a military committee since President Omar al-Bashir was overthrown in a coup in April.
The spectators of the sit-ins witnessed important events with real human feelings and which illustrated the deep Sudanese culture which was imprinted on the conscience of the Sudanese, and that will be documented in the country's history. We in the Military Council, we open our hands for unconditional negotiations in the interest of the nation, where through it we will continue the foundation for a legitimate authority that will reflect the aspiration of the Sudanese revolution in all varieties.
Well, for more on this story, let's cross over to London, from where the African Affairs analyst and publisher of Africa Briefing, John Ofe-Ansah, has been monitoring developments in Sudan. Good to talk with you, John. Now, this time yesterday, we were talking about how the Transitional Military Council said that all talks and agreements with the pro-democracy demonstrations were being cancelled. Now it seemed to have changed its mind. Do we know why? I mean, could it possibly be because of the international backlash following the violence?
Well, partly due to the international backlash, but I would attribute it to mostly to the resolve, the resoluteness of the protesters who have vowed not to cow, all right, in the face of any armed crackdown, or anything of the sort. So I think the junta is rather, bowing to the resolve, the absolute resolve of the people.
What you're saying, I suppose the next logical question is to tell us what you know about what's happening on the streets of Khartoum. There are lots of reports coming in of the dreaded Janjaweed paramilitary group roaming the streets, beating and shooting people.
Yes, the situation, I don't see any improvement to the situation now, because it appears, where the Janjaweed, that's the popular name for the Rapid Support Force, which was set up by ex-President al-Bashir during the Darfur War. And they are noted for their brutality, right? And it is commanded, their commander is now the deputy head of the junta. Okay, so they have been carrying out these, these atrocities, in Sudan, not only in Khartoum, but in other parts of the country. And it appears the main army, the regular army, are incapable of controlling this RSF, popularly known as the Janjaweed. It appears they are incapable of controlling them. So until the general in charge of the general Bohan is able to bring them under control, the situation will not improve. It will rather escalate for the worse.
Well, that's interesting, because I mean, it means that whatever it is we're hearing from the military council can be cancelled, if you like, by the Janjaweed. And I'm still very curious to understand how this Janjaweed militia fit into the military establishment. I mean, you explained it fairly well there, but I mean, I understand that the Transitional Military Council, which is the ruling regime and which you would think has all power in Sudan, is made up of several bodies, including the army, as well as these rapid support bodies that you talked about, each with its own interests. I mean, but of course the Janjaweed appear to be the most dominant and the most feared.
Exactly. I mean, since the uprising, the mass uprising began last December, it was generally peaceful, and even the regular soldiers were